Greetings, students. This week we're going to be talking about what folks call the invisible or deep web, and much of that involves search portals and directories on the free web. We'll contrast that to the dark web, and we'll also take a little look in a separate lecture at intellectual property buckets. So let's look at our essential questions. We'll be examining, is there an invisible or deep web? What parts of the web are unfindable by traditional search engines? What role do human managed directories play in our search toolkits? And what is the dark web? Our agenda this week is to examine the meaning of the deep, hidden, or invisible web, to tour a few of those examples, to take a look at the definition of the dark web and see how it is accessed. On your own, you'll be looking at two voices of search in specialized areas of search, Sarah Glassmeyer for legal search and Caitlin Costello in health, specifically consumer health search. And in that separate lecture, I'd like you to learn a little bit more about how intellectual property fits into our search toolkit, both finding it and actually applying some licenses to your own work. I have to tell you, and I think I've said this before, that the buckets into which I'm dividing our categories by what we're learning week by week are a little bit leaky. You're going to find that there are things that we could easily talk about in several weeks, and you're going to find some things that kind of defy categorization. And we're just talking about these categories. They've been certainly applied professionally, but I want you to be aware that there are things that are resisting fitting in buckets nicely. So that being said, let's try to define things and categorize things. Not so long ago, CNN Money did a wonderful exploration of what the deep web is. And if you take a look at the diagram, and this is an interactive infographic, you see Google and Bing floating along the surface, and that surface is also, the free web is all that search engines can get to, is known as the surface web. And a little bit below that, you're going to see directories, and we'll explain what sorts of things are not findable by the nets that the major search engines use to scan the web. And then down below, you're going to see something that folks are calling the dark web, and that is harder to get to by definition, and we'll take a look at what that means. But I encourage you to read this short article in CNN Money, their online version, and also to click along on that little infographic. This is an infographic or an image I have been having trouble finding attribution for. It looks to me like Deep Web Technologies created it, but it's another visual of the sorts of things that are on the surface web, sorts of things that are on the deep, or whatever other people call the invisible web. As you can see, there's some government resources, academic information, medical records, and we'll look at what these categories are in some slides to come. And then you can see the dark web is categorized by private sorts of things, including things that are illicit, but also things that people keep private to protect themselves. There is some stuff about refugees who are trying to get out of countries, for instance, that might be an example of deep web stuff, but that is not necessarily evil or illicit. So keep all those things in mind in terms of loose categories as we move forward. So why do we use directories, the invisible or deep web, when we have search engines? We use them because they are just a little different. They're selective. They're organized by humans. They are classified with human talent. They are browsable rather than searchable, and that can promote discovery. We use it sometimes when we have general questions. They can, in addition to be browsed, they also can be searched. Also, when we are just beginning to know a subject area, sometimes using a directory allows us to understand what the categories of knowledge are within that subject area. So those are some reasons we might look at a directory rather than go directly to a search engine. Some reasons not to use directories are the opposite. They're small coverage. They do have lesser search functionality than search engines. Sometimes you'll find ads and paid inclusion, and that varies across the directories. And they may not index the entire sites that they list. They may look at just the front page, for instance, of a website, and you may not actually get the deepest information that you're looking for. So a definition of the invisible, deep, or hidden web is all the information on the web which cannot be located by general purpose search engines. And it is the opposite. The surface web, the web that we're looking at when we search Wikipedia and Google and Bing, that is the opposite. It is the content of the web that is easily available to the general public and searchable with the search engines I just mentioned. In the Extreme Searcher's Handbook, which Randolph Hawk has generously offered a number of links you'll see on the free web, he describes reasons why some of the material on the deep web is not available to search engines. Sometimes search engines do not know about the pages. Nobody submitted the URL. The search engine has decided not to index the content, often because the page changes frequently. The search engine has been asked not to index the content by the presence of the site's robot file. The search engine does not have or use technology to index non-HTML content. So in the past, more often, audio and video were harder to find because they did not compact with readable data. That is changing, though. And sometimes these things are buried under firewalls, and the search engine cannot access that password-protected content. Wikipedia lists several categories of deep web content types, and I'm not going to read them all to you, but I hope that you do read them. Again, they list the non-HTML or text content is harder to find, the private web, the stuff that requires that firewall login, pages that are only accessible through links produced by JavaScript. These are the content dynamically downloaded from web servers. Some software is hidden, unlinked content. Web archives, for instance, will look at the Wayback Machine. Some of that may be findable by search engines, but if you know an old search engine, an old web page exists, sometimes it's really just easier to go back to the Wayback Machine to find it. So we'll look at some examples of these. I want you on your own, especially because it might help you with your search activity this week, to take a look at Randolph Hawk's categories from his Extreme Searchers site. And they are divided into directories and portals, a reference shelf, sight and sounds for media, and news resources. And I'm hoping that you'll be able to share some of the best of in your My Favorite Portal activity. It's important to note that the web started out or developed in its early years with far more directories than, or web scale directories than we're seeing now. This tombstone represents some of my favorite directories that have died over the last 10 years or so. And so these were really brilliant examples of people doing good work to help others find information. Closer look at them, Google, I'm hoping some of you may be old enough to remember that Google did have a directory, and for me, I found it very useful working with high school students. It linked to all sorts of fabulous things like trade journals and news sources that are harder to search than browse for. Similarly, Yahoo had probably the most extensive directory out there. And Internet Public Library 1 and 2, I was honored to be a speaker at their, I think it was their 10-year anniversary. They really made life easy for people who were looking for specific types of content and really created a fabulous directory for kids and young people. So you can't look at them here, but you might be able to take a look at these on the Wayback Machine. I'm not sure. Some existing examples with kind of long histories are the World Wide Web Virtual Library, also called VL. It is the oldest catalog on the web. It was started by Tim B.L. or Berners-Lee in 1991 in CERN, at CERN. And it continues to be run by a confederation of volunteers who compile web links in key areas in which they are expert. This is recognized as being one of the highest quality guides to particular areas on the web, and it's certainly worth a try. So these areas I think is interesting to think about as you're building LibGuides and your own search guides. It might not be a bad idea to see what folks are gathering on these large-scale directories or these or some of the subject-specific directories. They will guide you, and LibGuides, in fact, is another good source as directories themselves of this kind of content by experts. Another classic is the Open Directory Project, also known as DMOZ. Just as the Oxford English Dictionary became the definitive word on words through the efforts of volunteers, DMOZ follows in the footsteps to become the definitive catalog of the web. And it was founded in the spirit of the open source movement way back in the 90s and 98, and it is the only major directory that is 100% free, and it is absolutely in that open source spirit, and generally you'll see that the word open signifies that in a number of web projects. I've been talking around the Wayback Machine, but the Internet Archive, with its Wayback Machine, was founded by Brewster Kahle, one of the web pioneers. I had the pleasure to meet at Rutgers just last year. It was founded in 1996. It's a San Francisco-based nonprofit digital library where the mission is universal access to all knowledge. It aims to collect everything with free public access to any digitized material, including websites, software applications, games, music, movies, moving images, and nearly 3 million public domain books. In addition to its archiving function, the archive is an activist organization advocating for free and open internet. And if you look, this screenshot that I had to divide in half represents many of the archives that are part of Internet Archive. And you can see the Wayback Machine is available on the top. I'm just going to share a couple of my favorite parts of the Internet Archive. And one of my very favorite ones is the TV News Archive. It was launched in September 2012, and it allows the general public, as well as journalists, scholars, teachers, librarians, and civic organizations, to easily find and borrow news. And one of the lovely things is because the news is archived with text, it has become more discoverable. And one part of this TV News Archive was the 9/11 archive, and this is growing both in its front and back end. So the new news is coming in, and it's all indexed with metadata. But old news, they're beginning to work in that direction as well. One of the impressive areas is that 9/11 collection, which minute by minute displays news from all over the world, findable from its text transcripts. It's a brilliant collection, and it's just fantastic to examine and see how the news people were reacting to the news as it happened. I mentioned the Wayback Machine, and the Wayback Machine actually allows you to see websites that are no longer live. So if you want to see my first website from 1996, my first virtual library, you can actually find a copy of it there. You just need the URL, and it will dig up these old websites so you can see various versions and histories of websites. And this is especially useful if a patron comes in with a question and the site is down. You can try to find the URL, and the site won't open, but it will likely open in the Wayback Machine. Other collections that you'll see in the Internet Archive are there's at least one, there's probably two or three, games archives, which allows you to play classic arcade and video games The Grateful Dead was always generous and open with its music, and so all the band's tapes are on there. The Prelinger archives of open source video, lots of classic films, and also some propaganda and some how to do it things. There's some real interesting gems there, and most of these are public domain. And then there's the old time radio archives, which are just fun to listen to and interesting for folks who are researching in that arena. Another classic is a friend of mine and Rutgers graduate, Kathy Schrock, who in 1995 decided to create a directory for things educational on the web. And in 1999, she became a partner with Discovery Education and did her work under the Discovery banner in 2012 when the site was retired. Right now, she has this current website, which is Kathy Schrock's Guide to Everything. And if you're an educator, this is an astounding number of really high-quality resources that she curates for the education community. Speaking of education, there's an awful lot of stuff that may not be findable through the web, and so all of these directories of open educational material, yes, maybe some of it can be found, especially the TED Talks, but in some cases you really do have to go into, for instance, the MIT Course Archive to find this stuff. And so it's important to know that these open educational resources are directories on their own, and some of them may be worth gathering on your own curation sites. Similarly, the government information, the free web search engines may lead you to the opening pages of some of these, but they may not dig deeply into the data that are in these huge portals. And this is the new version of government information, which offers access to the congressional records, and you can chart the course of legislation. And this is the new beta interface of GovInfo. You also have access to census data, which you can manipulate in a variety of ways now. And so this stuff the census page is locatable by the search engines, but the stuff that you generate there may not be. So it's important to know about these government sites. Similarly, the Bureau of Labor Statistics has a number of sites. The one that I probably use the most often in libraries is the Occupational Outlook Handbook. There's also the CIA Handbook. I haven't put all of these in here, but when you need information on jobs and what the future for a particular position looks like, what people make, what the typical day looks like, this is a standard reference book that is now a website. One of the most famous directories is Project Gutenberg, which was actually founded before the GUI internet, or actually the internet itself, in 1971 by Michael S. Hart. It is now the oldest digital library, and most of the items in it are full text of public domain books. It tries to make these as free as possible in formats that are usable on almost any computer. Another of our government websites is Medline Plus, which is part of the National Institutes of Health website. It's aimed at patients and their families. It has a friendly directory look. It is one of the world's largest medical libraries, bringing information about diseases, conditions, wellness issues in language that the average consumer can understand. A huge directory is the directory of open access journals, and this is a big movement. There are a number of journals that are emerging, not wanting to be behind the firewall of some of the major companies that I won't name, and they want to have, in many cases, peer review content out there that is freely accessible, especially when some of their studies are government funded. And so as a result, you have the DOAJ, the Directory of Open Access Journals. This is an international directory. There is a lot of stuff here that is very niche-y, but it is something that you ought to be aware of as an alternative or in addition to the database hub that you see at your university. And so this is a growing movement. We looked at Wolfram Alpha as a search engine a couple weeks ago, but I want you to know that it is also an example of the stuff that is on the invisible web. So if you do, I did a study, right? My search was comparing New York City to Philadelphia, kind of very basic search, but that particular generated chart exists probably nowhere else. It generated on the fly with the computational data that Wolfram Alpha applies. And so the stuff that generates as results in Wolfram Alpha is also stuff that is invisible for many search engines. In the legal arena, you find really major directories that may or may not find data, that may not find the data from which you may not find on the free web easily through search engines. And so this is one example. It's FindLaw, and it helps consumers and small business owners and students and even legal professionals find answers to everyday questions, and also points to legal counsel when it's necessary. It includes case law, state and federal statutes, a directory of lawyers, and legal news and analysis. Cornell University also provides the Legal Information Institute, and it's housed at Cornell Law School, and it makes use of publishers, legal scholars, computer scientists, government agencies, all of whom are interested in promoting open access to law worldwide. So they publish law for free, and they create materials that help the consumer understand law. Just going through a couple of other ones. This is another government data, directory. It's the USDA's Natural Resource Conservation Service. If you're interested in flora and fauna, this is a good resource for you, especially in terms of agricultural studies. Of course, the Library of Congress has so many digital collections. The deeper depths of them are maybe harder to find on a search engine than they would be if you entered through the portal of the Library of Congress or the specific American Memory Collection. The public domain review is growing as more public domain content gets indexed there, and this is a multimedia collection, often just really fun to browse through. BASE is a directory of scholarly, academic, open access resources operated at Bielefeld University Library. It now contains more than 80 million documents from more than 4,000 sources, many of which are full text. And so the stuff that is archived or indexed here is intellectually selected, and it has to meet the requirements of academic quality and relevance. Let's see, moving on. And then there's PubMed, which is an index of biomedical literature from Medline, also a government resource from the National Library of Medicine. One category of deep web material we'll look at just a little bit later again is the category of preprints. They are versions of academic papers that are released prior to peer review publication. They are often not typeset. You may discover errors in them. And right now, when scientific discovery is paramount and quick access to discoveries and shared access to discoveries that could be useful globally are important. Sometimes scholars, scientists, academics won't wait for the peer review process to share their information. And so very often they release their work in preprints. These are findable on the web if you know how to look for them. There's also a category called postprints. They are peer-reviewed articles. They are in preparation for publication in journals, and they also might differ from their final forms. When you think about both of these categories or buckets, they're usually referred to as e-prints. And they can be discovered in a variety of ways. Google Scholar often lists PDFs on the right side of its result list. And very often those PDFs lead to preprints or postprints that are stored in places outside of the scholarly journals. Some of them are open access, but many of them live in things called archives or on a scholar or scientist's own website, often with permission. And many of them, while they are published as well, are available free. You do need to be careful about what version you're looking at and the type of scrutiny that is required by the discipline for which the article was published. There are a number of depositories for universities. Cornell maintains this particular place called Archive, actually. It's a repository of electronic preprints known as ePrints, also approved for publication after moderation that consists of scientific papers. And in this case, and many cases, preprints are actually in the fields of science and math. And so you can look for these repositories. They are all over the place. In fact, use the word repository in your search. We'll talk about this in a minute. Use the word preprint in your search. Use the file format PDF in your search, and you will be able to find content that might be behind paywalls or very hard to find, as we were talking about with some of the other content that is on the deep web. Gray literature is a type of deep web content that is also growing. It has not been formally published. It exists in academia, but it also exists in business. It exists for organizations and associations. This stuff is produced more quickly and more flexibly, again, than the traditional peer review process. And it's a response to issues relating to the control of commercial publishing. Also, gray literature is this kind of material that people who post it may not even think it has value to the outside world. For instance, when I had a student doing a LibGuide on crafts for young people, some of the material we found were from 4-H clubs, and they had produced materials on crafts for their own membership, not really thinking it might have value beyond. But once we started searching by file format for PDF, we found this gray literature that was very helpful and embeddable. And I don't know whether we asked permission or not, but it was available on the web, and we linked to it. So this notion of going deeper than your search engine can be very, very helpful, not only for the sciences or for academics, but for this kind of ephemeral material that people don't really consider has value for sharing, but often it's valuable. And I'll talk about another example of that in a minute. Gray literature can be challenging to find because it's not included in databases. The sciencey kinds of gray literature can be found in places, and maybe not so sciencey, in Scopus and Web of Science. And another really cool place we talked about earlier in our database unit was dissertations and theses. They can be found in ProQuest, but very often scholars or academics or students will put their theses and dissertations up on their own website. So you can find them that way, often with a PDF file type. Gray literature includes, as I mentioned, useful documents by nonprofits, non-governmental organizations, associations, think tanks, research groups, government, industry, and as we mentioned with 4-H, community groups. It comes in many different flavors. Gray literature is available in the form of white papers, patents, working papers, preprints and postprints, theses and dissertations, handbooks, syllabi, conference proceedings, poster abstracts, government reports, unpublished clinical reports, maps, fact sheets, newsletters, and policy statements. So you can see there's a wealth of stuff out there that often goes untapped by searchers. Gray literature has some benefits. It may be more up to date than literature that has to go through the traditional publishing process, and it may provide new and additional perspectives on a topic. Though it is often of high quality, it has to be evaluated if you're going to use it for serious purposes. You can find gray literature in addition to the repositories. You can find it in some government websites and portals like the ones we talked about earlier, USA.gov, clinicaltrials.gov, ERIC for Education, Web of Conferences, and Open Door, which is another example of those free open access portals. And as I alluded to earlier, searching by file type is a very helpful way of finding gray literature. In this case, we're looking for documents on aging that are in PDF format. And as you can see, we're finding some material that I don't know that we would have found otherwise. And as we mentioned, Mary Ellen Bates loves to search using file type, and file type often will bring up PDFs, but don't be afraid to search if you need data for Excel spreadsheets or Google Excel files or Google Sheets files, or even within email spreadsheets. So you can see, you could even search within your own organization using /, and search for documents that are only available to you in your own organization. So these are really cool tricks for finding information that is hidden deeply in the deep web. Let's move from these directories, which you'll be exploring partly on your own for your activity. Let's move to what people call the darknet, the dark web. And so the dark web is actually a portion of the deep web that it is intentionally hidden and very difficult to access, and often, actually almost always, requiring a specific software like the Onion router to open. Interestingly, it was developed by the U.S. Navy to protect sensitive communication, but now some consider it a haven for underground and emergent subcultures, criminal and unethical behavior and activity. Jamie Bartlett wrote a book fairly recently in 2014 called The Darknet, and there are a lot of really scary stories in this work, and if you're interested in this, take a look at his book. This is an image that represents Tor, which is the Onion browser. It is the most common software used to access the darknet. The darknet websites are not indexed by the normal search engines, and you need the special browser, and you need to access this content with a disguised IP address. One of the biggest marketplaces for the dark web was called Silk Road. It was founded in 2011. And it was anonymous. It had a friendly consumer-like feel, similar to Amazon, and it created a platform for vendors to buy and sell goods using the Bitcoin currency as untraceable. It became the go-to website for contraband until it was shut down in 2013 by the FBI. This is the FBI notice that arrested the founder of Silk Road, Ross Ulbricht, and certainly welcome to take a look at that. But it's interesting to note that Silk Road was replaced fairly shortly by Silk Road 2 and I think Silk Road 3, then other marketplaces like Agora and Alphabay. And this stuff is found on the regular web by places, and you can see a link that I have there to subreddits, which can lead you to the darknet marketplaces. I want to play you a brief CNBC video documentary on the dark web that I think will put everything in perspective.
Drugs and other contraband, but it remained hidden from casual internet users for years because of something called the dark web. So what exactly is this dark side of the internet? If you think of the web like an iceberg, you've got the surface web up top. That's the internet you see and use every day. What's submerged is the deep web, an anonymous online space only accessible with specific software. And then there's the dark web. Now that's the part of the deep web that hides your identity and location.
The dark web is a series of encrypted networks that serve to anonymize people's use on the internet.
That's Matt Swenson. He's a special agent with the Department of Homeland Security, and his focus is on cybercrime. It's relatively easy for anyone to access this encrypted network. All it takes is downloading Darknet software.
The most common dark web networks that we encounter right now are Tor, I2P, and Freenet. Tor is by far and away the most popular.
Tor stands for the Onion Routing Project. It was actually developed by the Navy for the government back in the mid-1990s, but it was open sourced in 2004, and that's when it went public. It's now the dark web browser that the vast majority of people use.
Tor allows a person to surf the internet anonymously so that their web traffic is basically encrypted, and when they view the web, the encrypted traffic won't be attributed to them or their location.
To understand how Tor actually works, you need to know what happens when you typically search the web. Think of your IP address as an online identity. Any device you use to connect to the internet has one. So anytime you visit a website, you could be traced back to your exact location thanks to that IP address. The Tor browser looks like any other, except there's a whole lot happening that you don't see. Instead of your connection request bouncing from its origin right to its destination, Tor sends your request on a much more roundabout route. So let's say you're in New York and you want to search a site hosted in New Jersey. Instead of connecting you directly, the Tor browser takes you on at least 3 random detours called relays. So your request could go from New York to South Africa, from South Africa to Hong Kong, and then from Hong Kong to New Jersey. Tor is comprised of people from all over the planet who are donating their computers to the network. It has more than 7,000 relays to choose from. Bouncing your request around to random computers all over the world makes it much harder for people to find you. Software firm Hyperion Gray put together this map showing all 6,608 dark websites crawled during January 2018. Each screenshot is a site, and the content ranges from the nefarious to the noble. For some users, like journalists or whistleblowers, the dark web is just about identity protection, where individuals can share anonymous tips with the press on secure drop sites. But more often than not, it's tied to the world of cybercrime. Special agents like Swenson are looking for the kinds of users who want this full cloak of anonymity in order to mask their illegal activity. Putting a stop to this kind of crime has been described as a never-ending game of whack-a-mole for law enforcement. But even with the odds seemingly stacked against them, the anonymity of the dark web can sometimes play to the law's advantage. No ID and no location means you never really know who you're talking to.
As the video mentioned, and as I alluded to earlier, the dark web is not entirely bad. The anonymity it provides is actually doing good in some regards. We take for granted often that we live in a democracy and that there are people around our world who do not have freedom of speech and need to get their stories out or to communicate with others, and they can't easily do that. Law enforcement uses the dark web to infiltrate and actually help catch criminals like child pornographers. In this case, there is a doctor, this is an article from Wired, a doctor who provides an important service on the dark web in terms of making sure that folks are making informed decisions about illegal drugs that they put into the system. So somebody's out there actually trying to protect people who are using illegal drugs. And as I said before, there are other reasons people are using the dark web. There are political prisoners, perhaps, who don't want or political activists who don't want their voices heard and findable very easily. But it is important to notice that the government is all over the dark web, and so I suppose there's a kind of battle to be darker and darker. I'm going to be, it's a kind of impossible for us to cover media search. We looked at a little bit at how we're searching for images now when we looked at Google image search pretty intensely with Dan Russell. But I want you to be aware that there are, especially in the book that I pointed to by Hawk, lists of ways that people find data. And this is some of the sites I used, and I pointed my students to find open data that were available when they created infographics. This is from a LibGuide that I did, but please feel free to look at these. Some of these are not just tables, but they are ways to create new data tables and charts, and there's some fabulous examples of how you can use these data sets to do real important work, to create PSAs and infographics, and just find the material that your customers, patrons, and students need. I wanted to point you to some of these directories that Hawk has pointed to, noting that some of them have died since the book was published, but just as an example of what's out there. And I'm going to point you to a second lecture that I'm doing this week, and you can certainly split this over the 2 weeks, which is about finding copyright-friendly media and how to put license on your own works. So summing up, this week we looked at the deep, hidden, or invisible web and how it compares to the surface web. We toured a few deep web examples. We took a little look at the dark web and sorts of things that are contained there and what people buy there. We will be looking at intellectual property and the buckets into which it fits, public domain, copyright, fair use, and Creative Commons over the next couple of weeks. And then next time, we'll be looking at social media search and curation for search and personal knowledge management. And I will see you in the discussions.